Well, welcome everyone to a talk about Bernardo O'Higgins. And many thanks to Laura for suggesting I talk about him. I guess everyone who's been to Chile has heard his name, but if you're like me, you didn't know very much about his actual life. So it's been really interesting looking into it and finding out really how the illegitimate son of an Irishman ended up as Chile's supreme director for 9 years. So an incredible and very unusual story. But to start with, I thought I'll just give a little bit of background on what was happening in the years just before O'Higgins became such a figure. And of course, it all starts with the Spanish Empire, which in the 1700s was at its maximum extent. It was a monarchy, but the largest units of administration were the viceroyalties, of which at the beginning of the 18th century, there were just two. New Spain, which was North America, their North American territories, and Peru, which was all of pretty much South America. And then in the 18th century, they subdivided a bit more, and the Viceroyalty of New Granada was created, which we talked about with Simón Bolívar the other day, and the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata was also divided out, but Peru still kept control of Chile, as I think you can see from that map. So I think the Viceroy of Peru was still the most important person in the Spanish administration in Latin America. The other interesting fact, and here is the Irish connection, is that in the 17th century, so 100 years earlier, there was a really close Iberian and Hibernian link. So Spain and Ireland, due mainly to their religious, both being Catholic nations, were very closely linked. Of course, the mutual distrust of the English probably helped as well. But Spain did send priests to Ireland to make sure the faith was maintained. And in 1680, there was a royal decree from Spain that gave the Irish the same rights as the Spanish for official posts. And if you bear in mind that to be an official in the Spanish Empire, you had to have been born in Spain or Ireland, that's pretty significant. Anyway, one guy who came from obscurity to the most important post in the Spanish Empire of South America was Mr. Ambrose Higgins as he started life. Pictured in this rather severe photo on the right, who was Bernardo's father. And we don't know very much about his early life, and he was definitely a late bloomer. He was born in 1720. He may have spent some time in the English army, apparently. He went to Spain and may well have studied there because the Spanish gave preference to and had schools for Irish people. And in 1756, he made his first trip to America, to South America in this case. His brother had married a lady of Asuncion, apparently. He may have traded in Peru. Again, we don't know very much about his early life. But he was always looking to better himself. We think he came from a humble, probably very humble beginning in Ireland. He made a second trip when he managed to get himself commissioned to be a draftsman, a poorly paid job, but it was a job to a fellow Irishman. they went to Latin America, and during those travels, they crossed from Argentina, today's Argentina, into Chile, across the pass at Mendoza in winter. They had a really hard crossing, and he came up with an idea of building refuges that would protect travelers on this really risky crossing, yet so important. And in fact, 5 years later, he was actually commissioned to construct them. But his first job in Chile was down in the south, at Valdivia. He was asked to draw up plans for the fortification of Valdivia. This was the frontier of the war, continual war really, against the native Araucanian Indians. And the population of Valdivia at that time was just 1,000 non-native and 250 soldiers. And actually, Ambrose got on very well with the locals. He particularly enjoyed their gatherings, their parliaments, as they called them. And they seem to have got on well with him. So southern Chile was always an attractive place to him. When I say southern Chile, I mean what today is part of really central Chile. The capital of the southern part of Chile was Concepcion, so well north of the Lake District. Anyway, he went back to Spain in 1766 for his health partly, but also to butter up the authorities. Which was important for him to do, to come to the attention of the authorities, because that was the only way you got promotion. So he came back to Chile, and in 1768 there was an uprising in the south, and he applied for a commission in the army, and ended up commanding the Frontier Dragoons, which he was very good at. He developed the sort of cavalry actions of the Frontier Dragoons. Cavalry were really important when you were fighting against lances with bayonets. So that was a successful period of his life, some years of his life. But he also supported trade. He was quite a liberated guy. He supported trade rather than liquor as a way of subduing the natives. In 1773, he went to Lima, probably for the first time, to report to the viceroy, and who he noticed had a separate palace just for his mistress. Anyway, shortly after that, he became governor of Chile, around about this time, he had an affair with a woman called Isabel Riquelme, who came from a respectable family from just south of Santiago. Bernardo was born in 1778. Isabel was 19, and Ambrosio was 58. And because 20th of August, his birthday, was the feast of St. Bernard, he was called Bernardo. So Ambrose's life proceeded. He was successful. He hadn't at this stage met his son at all. He was eventually made Captain General of Chile, which was the most senior official in the country. Not bad for an Irishman from a humble background. We can tell he was Irish because they called him El Camarón, the prawn, perhaps because of his complexion. And in 1788, he managed to get a document, probably of dubious origins, saying he was descended from Shining Duff O'Higgins, the Baron of Balinari, which the Spanish crown were delighted to confirm must have been authentic, and they made him Baron Vallenar, which is when he added the O to his Higgins. And his career progressed until he was eventually, in 1794, promoted to be Viceroy of Peru, so the most important official in the Spanish Empire of South America. and at this time Bernardo was 16. He died in the end in 1801. I'll come back to this, but this picture here is his memorial plaque in Lima, because of course the Viceroy of Peru was based in Lima. Now, just back to Bernardo, who'd been born, who hadn't met his father. He spent his first 4 years with foster parents, paid for by Ambrose, but with foster parents and friends of acquaintances in Chile, a bit south of Santiago. I put this rather pretty picture on the screen. It's in fact much further south. That's near Picon, which would have been a war zone then. But I think it was an attractive scenery wherever he was. And Bernardo very much loved his southern Chile. Both of them did, in fact. Ambrose was named as the father on Bernardo's baptism certificate. But if he met him at all, he probably only met him once, when this old man, 68 years old, was introduced to Bernardo when he was 10. And he may or may not have been told that this man was his father. But he did know that his father was this important official and was paying for his education and all the rest of it. So his early years were spent south of Santiago, and in 1790, Bernardo was sent to school in Lima, bearing in mind that Ambrose was still in Chile at this point, so no great paternal affection there. And then in 1794, he was sent to school in London, and that was the same year that Ambrose was made Viceroy of Peru. So again, their paths didn't cross. In London, Bernardo lived in Richmond with a family called the Eels. And if you look carefully in Richmond, and I know some of you have seen this plaque already because I think one of you sent it to me, there is a blue plaque to Bernardo commemorating his stay in London. I don't think he went to school in Richmond, he was tutored, so he would have learnt at home. He got on well with the Eels family, who he was with, but he lost touch with them in the end. He was fairly impoverished at this stage because the money his father was sending to his guardian in Spain was being sort of a little diverted on the way, shall we say. And so he had to come up with he wrote to his father, who never replied. And I love this bit. Although I've written to Your Excellency on several occasions, fortune has never favoured me with any reply, being seemingly hostile to me in this. So he was very good at pleading, but it had absolutely no effect. One person he did meet in London was Francisco Miranda, who we came across again with Simon Bolivar, who was based in London at this time, was tutoring maths, but of course also was tutoring revolutionary ideas, and got on well with O'Higgins, found fertile ground for his ideas of the independence of the Spanish colonies in Latin America. Higgins was very trusting of other people. That was both an advantage to him and a disadvantage. And when O'Higgins left London for Cadiz in Spain, Miranda gave him a hand-crafted document all about the revolutionary ideals that O'Higgins sewed into his coat in case it was found. And it told him to love his country and several pages of other stuff, and told him don't trust anyone over 40. And funnily enough, Miranda gave similar advice to Simon Bolivar a few years later in 1806. Anyway, Higgins finished his tutoring in London, moved to Cadiz to be closer to his guardian. I suppose he thought he might get more money that way, but absolutely not. The guardian only employed him, despite his own great wealth, as an unpaid clerk, and Bernardo had a pretty miserable time. In 1800, England was at war with Spain again. We seemed to go in and out of war with Spain, France, all that lot during these years. And a plot was uncovered to encourage revolt in Latin America. And there were several names on this document, and one of those was Bernardo's, I guess because of his contact with Miranda in London. And word of this filtered back to the Viceroy in Peru. And in 1801, O'Higgins received a letter, well, his guardian received a letter from his father saying he disowned him and he was to be thrown out of his guardian's house. He wrote to his father to protest, but by the time the letter reached Lima, Don Ambrosio had died. So those were Bernardo's early years and his teenage years of being fairly much ignored, disowned, all the rest of it. His luck then slightly turned because in 1802 there was a truce between England and Spain. Bernardo was forgiven in his father's will. One of his friends probably persuaded him that he really should leave something to his only illegitimate child. And he was left an estate called Las Canteras in southern Chile, which is 500 kilometers south of Santiago. It was an estate that Ambrose had bought from when he was living in Chile. So that potentially, it certainly gave him credit, if not money. So he was able to travel back to Chile, where he returned in September of that year and sorted out the probate and all that sort of thing, and was reunited with his mother, who he had been corresponding with throughout. And he spent several years running the estate of Las Canteras in his early 20s at this stage. And over the next few years, as we know, Napoleon invaded Portugal. That really sparked off the independence movement in the Latin American colonies. The first one was Argentina, the first one to declare its independence, which was in 1810. And Chile followed suit in a rather Chilean and polite way later that year by ousting their aged governor in September and installing a junta, a military grouping of their own. Though it wasn't an anti-royalist, they were still quite happy to profess their loyalty to Ferdinand, who was the King of Spain, though not in power because Napoleon was there. So O'Higgins, this sort of sparked his independence, his thoughts, and he became slightly more political during these years. He saw political wranglings in Santiago. He looked for a military mentor, and most of his life was spent with various mentors. San Martín was one of his mentors. Cochrane was probably a great and useful mentor to him. And he found a fellow Irishman called Juan McKenna, who had been very respected by his father, funnily enough, who advised him to find a good sergeant from the frontier dragoons if he wanted to learn about military matters, because he knew that Chile as a whole needed arms and it needed a trained army if it was to maintain its independence. So there were many political wranglings at this point, and two main factions in Santiago, the one that O'Higgins belonged to, and a slightly farier one led by the Carrera family. And José Miguel Carrera is the other picture you can see on the screen there. They kept seizing power. O'Higgins got despondent. He decided to leave the country for Argentina. But then in 1813, the Viceroy of Peru landed a force in the south. And that sort of reunited the various factions, the independence factions in Chile. And previous differences were forgotten. And there were various skirmishes. And O'Higgins' training with the frontier dragoons obviously came in. He was respected, And in 1814, he was eventually appointed commander of the Chilean army, replacing José Miguel Carrera. Now, this wasn't such a grand job as it sounds. He only had 1,800 rather poorly trained men. So really his only option when the royalists arrived was to negotiate a treaty with them, which he did, which recognized Ferdinand as the king, but promised no return to the colonial administration. Shortly after that, Carrera staged yet another coup and declared himself dictator, but he lost support of the public. And there was a sort of period of almost civil war. Well, it was civil war in Chile. Now, there was a bad defeat, really, for the Patriots at a place called Rancagua. And there was a fierce battle. O'Higgins was very valiant and led a charge against bayonets, but it was nonetheless a defeat. Carrera's performance showed some cowardice, apparently. So basically, O'Higgins' popularity rose, Carrera's fell a bit, but the end result for all of them was they had to flee the country because the royalists were back in charge. And so O'Higgins went with his family and a few soldiers over the Andes to Mendoza. Carrera fled north, but in the end also turned across the Andes. He had no other way to go, really, and also ended up in Mendoza. And in Mendoza was José de San Martín, who is another key figure from Latin America's independence, an Argentine, born in 1778, the same year, in fact, as Bernardo O'Higgins. But his formative life had been in Spain as a professional soldier. And that was very much what he was, not a politician at all by his own admission. His dream was to liberate Latin America from Spanish rule. He'd seen that Argentina had been liberated. He could see that Peru had to fall because the viceroy there was the most important person. And he could also see that the only way strategically to do that was that Chile had to be liberated on the way because of the access by sea mainly up the Pacific coast to Lima. So after many adventures, which I'm not going to go into today, he'd ended up in Mendoza, which you might think is a backwater, but he had a plan. He was developing the Army of the Andes, as it became to be called, and which was mainly Argentine, 90% Argentine soldiers, which he was training. He met O'Higgins and Carrera, both of whom sort of pressed themselves on him. And San Martin took to O'Higgins and saw straight through Carrera. So O'Higgins was invited back to Mendoza. He'd been in Buenos Aires for a while, to become one of the commanders for San Martin on this invasion plan to cross the Andes. Now, San Martin started with 1,500 troops and 4,000 militia. But by the end of a year, in 1816 this is, his army was at 4,000 well-trained men. And in January 1817, they set off across the Andes in an incredibly planned campaign with 9,000 mules, 1,600 horses, 600 head of cattle. And he sent several groups of soldiers on different routes in case they're intercepted, but all carefully coordinated so that they arrived in the same point at the same time. There were a similar number of royalist troops in Chile, so he couldn't afford to get that wrong. And they crossed the Andes, they descended the other side, they totally surprised the royalists, they fought a battle here at Chacabuco and beat the royalists soundly, who lost a third of their number. That was a stunning success, really, and probably the high point of San Martin's career. When they entered Santiago to glorious acclaim, San Martin said this at the bottom: "The army of the Andes can always gloriously say, in 24 days we carried out our campaign, crossed the highest passes in the world, ousted tyrants, and gave Chile her liberty." So that was a great success. The royalists were fleeing to Valparaiso at this point, and O'Higgins, one of San Martin's generals by this time, wanted to cut off their retreat immediately. San Martin was always cautious and wouldn't let him. And of course, that was a mistake, because they had the opportunity to really finish the job there and they didn't. So over the next few years, there were a series of further battles for independence. San Martin was still in Chile, and when they walked into Santiago after Chacabuco, the populace of Chile wanted to proclaim San Martin their new leader, head of state, but he refused, and he recommended to the Chileans that they appoint O'Higgins instead, which everyone seems to have been very happy with, apart from a few Carreras maybe. And on the 16th of February, O'Higgins was proclaimed Director Supremo of Chile, a post he held for 9 years. Now, he was a modest, humble person, and he had many advantages. He got on well with people, but he was easily swayed. He was perhaps even gullible. But he also had another secret, and that was that he belonged to a secret society or lodge called the Lautaro Lodge. We're not quite sure because it's secret, but probably this started way back in London with Miranda and grew from there. But San Martin was also a member of this lodge, as was McKenna, who influenced O'Higgins, and as was Alvear, who you may have heard of because there's a wonderful hotel in Buenos Aires, the Alvear Palace, who was a leader in Buenos Aires a few years after this. But one of the things you had to promise to when you joined the lodge was that if you became head of a country, the lodge had to be consulted on all your appointments. So this tied his hands in many ways, and did make him make some decisions that lost him popularity. For example, he decreed that all coats of arms should be removed from houses. The Carrera faction, who were very much the aristocratic side, used propaganda to argue that the invasion of Chile had been by Argentina rather than by Argentines, and O'Higgins was their accomplice. So there was a lot of sort of bad feeling going around. In 1818, the Royalists regrouped in the south. A new fleet had been sent from Peru, and O'Higgins and San Martin were sent to help contain the situation. They had an unsuccessful encounter at a place called Cancha Rayada, where O'Higgins was wounded, and that instilled panic in Santiago that their fearless leader had been wounded, which was encouraged and whipped up by the Carrera factions. But anyway, he got over that, and there was a final battle at Maipú in 1818, and that picture shows San Martin and O'Higgins congratulating each other, which is generally considered to be the last battle for Chilean independence. But the Carrera family, who'd been chucked out, continued to scheme from Argentina. Their efforts mainly failed. It was 3 brothers and a sister. All 3 brothers were eventually executed. The last one, José Miguel, in 1820. But their bad mouthing of O'Higgins did have a lasting effect. Now, Ambrose, Bernardo's father, had recognized right at the beginning that Chile needed a navy to defend herself. And San Martin knew that to liberate Peru, he couldn't. He needed transport. He needed a navy. And O'Higgins absolutely agreed with all of that. And they did their best to start a navy themselves. They managed to capture a few Spanish ships. They captured one in 1817. They even managed to buy a couple, but they didn't have very much money. In 1818, a little Spanish fleet arrived from Spain, but they had a mutiny on the way, and there was a lot of confusion. One of the ships went into Buenos Aires and gave the game away, so O'Higgins knew they were coming. And they arrived in Talcahuano port, which is the port of Concepcion, south of Santiago, which had been abandoned by the royalists. But O'Higgins had heard of their plan, and he managed to capture their fleet by flying the Spanish flag, a bit of deception, which no doubt Cochrane, about to arrive, would have appreciated. So that was a great success and gave O'Higgins some welcome publicity, and it was very good for morale. And at this time, O'Higgins also realized that if they were going to have a navy, they needed someone who knew what they were doing to command it. So, against some people's advice, O'Higgins hired Lord Cochrane, about whom we'll hear more next time. But he was a brilliant, audacious, experienced sailor. I guess he was in his 40s at this point, who'd done really well in the Mediterranean and France, but had fallen out with authority and been thrown out of the British Navy a few years earlier. He was hired, and he arrived in November of that year with his wife and 2 children, and was given the Navy to train up. So this was the moment when San Martin was able to embark, or was nearly able to embark his fleet north to Chile. The fleet initially went up to Callao, which is the port of Lima, to reconnoiter and try a few little skirmishes. Cochrane tried some rockets, which I think he'd used in Europe to great success. But whatever his Spanish version was, they filled it with lime, sand, and manure. It didn't really work. And as San Martin had forbidden him from approaching too close to the shore, there wasn't much success in their initial encounters. San Martin and Cochrane were opposites. I think it's safe to say they didn't get on at all. They were both probably very brilliant in their own very different ways. So Cochrane got very frustrated by all this, and he took part of his fleet way south to Valdivia, which I guess because of Ambrose's fantastic designs was considered impregnable. Of course, that was nothing to Cochrane, who immediately captured it from the royalists. And this was wildly popular in Chile, and really cemented Cochrane's fame and popularity in Chile, which endures to this day, as we'll hear. The royalists who'd been ousted, the ones who got away, fled to Chiloé, and that was their last refuge in Chile. And funnily enough, was, I understand, one of Cochrane's very few unsuccessful attempts when he tried to go and capture them. Anyway, a few words on Peru's liberation, which sort of fits in here, because between the 10th and the 20th of August, 1820, the army, 4,000 strong, finally embarked on the Admiral Cochrane's at this stage, fleet from Valparaiso. And the flagship of Chile was appropriately enough called the O'Higgins. Now, Peru was a challenge. The royalists were deeply entrenched. They were arrogant. There were geographical challenges, just the terrain, the shore to the mountains. There was an indifferent native population. 50% of Peru's population were then native, probably unchanged today, actually. It was bankrupt. There were 17,000 troops, even though they were widely spread and poorly trained. But both San Martin and O'Higgins thought that just seeing the army of the Andes would mean Peru would just give up. And San Martin in particular wanted a bloodless independence for Peru, which didn't exactly happen as planned. It did happen in the end, but it took longer than he expected, despite several advantages that San Martin got. Guayaquil, for example, declared for the Patriots. One of the Viceroy's battalions defected. It was mainly made up of Colombians and Venezuelans. And Cochrane did another of his audacious schemes and captured the Spanish flagship, the Esmeralda. San Martin still wanted a bloodless victory, so he wouldn't attack, and he sailed north of Lima in the end, a mistake because half his army got ill up there. Trujillo in the end declared for the Patriots. The current viceroy, who was the fourth one since Ambrose, interestingly enough, was deposed by Peru's last viceroy, La Serna, who did abandon Lima and went to the mountains. So San Martin entered Lima on the 2nd of July, 1821, and independence of Peru was proclaimed on the 28th. So it was a difficult campaign, and San Martin's thinking at this time probably was muddled by opium. He wasn't at all well. He took opium to manage his symptoms with, I'm afraid, the inevitable results. And O'Higgins was in Chile all this time. This was just the army of the Andes with Chile's support liberating Peru. So San Martin was there. He didn't prove a very effective administrator either. It probably was an impossible situation. He proposed a monarchy. He was going to get some little prince from Europe to come and be the monarch in name. He fell out with Cochrane, who hadn't been paid, and managed to impound some public funds to pay his men, and then set off after some Spanish prizes. And in 1822, as we heard during the Simón Bolívar talk, San Martin went to Guayaquil to meet Simón Bolívar, whose star was absolutely in the ascendance at this time. And what they said together, we don't know. But I don't think San Martin got what he wanted, which was probably just military help from Bolívar. San Martin famously said after that meeting, "There is not enough room in Peru for both Bolívar and myself." So that was really the end of San Martin. Sort of left Peru on rather a down and returned to Mendoza, where he had a small farm, via Santiago, where he had a couple of weeks with O'Higgins, and said goodbye to him. But it was a rather tragic end to what could have been a glorious life. He intended to go back to Buenos Aires. His wife just died before he got there, and in the end he moved and spent the last years of his life in Europe with his only daughter. Now, O'Higgins, during all this time, had been in Chile managing things, and spent his final years in power. The effort of financing the Peruvian War had taken its toll, however. Argentina, which had promised to pay half, never did. Labour was short, the fields were bare, there was a war in the south to wage, which never really stopped, and nothing that O'Higgins did was enough. He introduced irrigation schemes, which are still in place all around Santiago, education, but he lost popularity. He'd probably been in power for too long. He'd also lost his most important and reliable mentors, and he made several ill-advised appointments against Cochrane's advice, it must be said, who got on very well with him. But Cochrane at this point resigned and left Chile in November of that year. He was nearly killed in an earthquake in Valparaiso, echoes of Bolívar in Caracas, maybe. And in 1823, he was finally forced by a once loyal officer, Freire, to resign. Whereupon he made a dramatic speech, bared his chest, and left Congress to tumultuous applause. But whichever way you look at it, he had resigned. And he was effectively told to go into exile. So he moved with his mother and half-sister, he always traveled with them, to Valparaiso to wait for a boat out of the country. While he was in Valparaiso, he wrote to Bolívar. They were always great correspondents, weren't they, these people? I guess otherwise we wouldn't know anything about them. To wish him well with his campaign in Peru, because at this point, Bolívar was having to re-liberate Peru. And 6 months later, he sailed to Peru in a British frigate called Fly, with his mother, his sister, and his son Pedro, from a dalliance that he'd had 4 years earlier, and with 2 adopted Araucanian girls. He may have been the father of one of them, but he was never married. And as he departed, which was the last time he left Chile, he wrote this letter to his fellow Chileans, and part of it says, "To whatever shores I may be carried, I shall always be with you and my beloved country. I shall ever remain its subject and your fellow citizen." So that was O'Higgins' departure from Chile. He arrived in Peru. We don't know whether he was aiming for Peru. One story says he was actually heading for Ireland and he was going to retire there. But since he'd never been to Ireland in his life, that seems, well, it might have been a nice idea at the time. Anyway, when he got off Lima, Bolívar was mid-liberation. So O'Higgins, being a helpful sort of a guy, immediately offered his support. Peru welcomed him because he was seen as a real hero there for supporting their liberation, and gave him a farm, an estate, a sugar estate actually, south of Lima called Montalvan. Though, slight word of caution on that, it was completely ravaged at the time and occupied by the royalists. Bolívar himself, this was the first time he'd met O'Higgins, wasn't at all sure what to make of him. I can imagine, again, they were very different characters, the sort of fiery Spaniard and the maybe slower moving Irishman. And also, I don't think Bolívar really trusted San Martin and knew that O'Higgins and San Martin had got on really well. But anyway, he seems to have come round to O'Higgins in the end. And in fact, in 1824, they both, Bolívar and O'Higgins, climbed the Andes, which was a month's arduous journey in search of the battles. But in fact, both had returned to Lima by the time that Sucre achieved his resounding victory at the Battle of Ayacucho, which was Peru's really final conquest of the royalists in the highlands. And back in Lima, while everyone else was glorious and resplendent in their epaulets and uniforms, O'Higgins deliberately dressed in civilian clothes and said, "From today, General O'Higgins no longer exists. I am only the private citizen, Bernardo O'Higgins. With Ayacucho, my American mission has ended." And I think that says something about his modesty. He spent his last 18 years at Montalvan, the estate, 155 kilometers south of Lima, just north of Ica and Paracas, for any of you who've been to Peru. Chile was still in a complete mess, really, at this time. It changed governments several times, but none of them seemed to want O'Higgins back. And his life's dream, really, was to go back to his native Chile. He almost got drawn into several conspiracies because people wanted to use him for propaganda purposes, but didn't, luckily, and eventually vowed never to get involved in politics again. In 1836, Chile invaded Peru, in fact, because there was a confederation of Peru and Bolivia, and, but that's another story. But O'Higgins did help to arrange a parley on that occasion. So he was still, from the back seat, taking a part in life that affected Chile. And then in 1840, his mother, Doña Isabel, finally died, which must have been a great blow to him. And shortly after that, a couple of years after that, he was finally invited back to Chile. But sadly, ill health overtook him. And even though he went to the port on 2 occasions to board a ship back to Chile, on both times he couldn't because of ill health, a heart attack. And he died on the 23rd of October, 1842. And when he died, he passed his estate to his illegitimate son, whom he had ignored for most of his life. One of life's little ironies. Anyway, and that's Bernardo O'Higgins, and a romantic, I feel, principled, gullible, diplomatic, but in a way, for me, a very typical Chilean. Just a really nice guy, it seems to me. And just to finish up, I thought I'd show you a few slides of places around Chile where his name today appears. Of course, most towns in Chile have a square called Plaza O'Higgins or somewhere, but this is one of his southernmost memorials. The famous Carretera Austral goes south from Puerto Montt down to Villa O'Higgins, which is on the southernmost border, well, not the southernmost, but the south border before the glaciers cut Chile in half. And there you are, 1,247 kilometers of the Carretera Austral. And you end up at the edge of a lake, Lago O'Higgins, which is a stunningly blue, that glacial meltwater. It's got this section where the various waterfalls just cascade into it. That's the rather rickety boat that takes one across it if you want to go and visit the Glacier O'Higgins, which is a stunning glacier. And at the southern end of the lake, you get to this little customs post of Candelario Mansilla. And from there on, the only way, if you want to continue your journey south to Argentina, is to walk 23 kilometers. And that's actually a beautiful walk. And then not just Bernardo, but some of his rivals got a look in on the naming process. So this is Lago General Carrera, which again is a stunning lake. It's shared, its waters are in both Argentina and Chile. It's a very large lake. And that's just one of the little hotels, Mirador de Guadal. If you're driving down the Carretera Austral, you probably end up staying at with stunning views over the lake. And then working our way gradually north, that's near Villarica, some of the lakes, which again, I feel this is almost O'Higgins country. And just stunningly beautiful, isn't it? You can see why he loved his country so much. And this is Villarica, where, funnily enough, if you'd been sitting on that bench where Nix is sitting in December, you would have seen a total solar eclipse go right over you. That's where it went. And there's another little statue. I think it's a statue of Bernardo. I can't think who else it would be, with his epaulets in Castro, the capital of Chiloé Island. So typical with its wooden shingles on all the buildings made from the Alesi tree. And one of you sent me that picture, isn't it a pretty picture? And then I thought I'd finish just with 2 slides of the very far south. Of course, this wasn't even really part of Chile then, but it just shows, this is, Magellan might have passed through here. This just shows how inaccessible Chile was at this time, and why it was Spain's most remote colony. That's the Pia Glacier in the southern fjords, and that is the Beagle Channel with Tierra del Fuego on the far side. And I think I might do one of my future talks on a wonderful character who many of you will probably have heard of, called Lucas Bridges, who wrote a wonderful autobiography called The Uttermost Ends of the Earth. And a little reading list for you. There are very few books on Bernardo O'Higgins, and not many of them are still in print. But for me, the standout one was Clissold's book. He was a diplomat. He lived in, there we are. He lived in Santiago, and while he was there, working for the Foreign Office, I guess, he wrote a really accessible book on Bernardo O'Higgins and the independence of Chile. The scholarly account of San Martin is John Lynch's, and it tells far more about San Martin than I had time to talk about today. And if you find it, David Mitchell wrote a small little book on digestible little book on Bernardo. So that was him. And so thank you very much for that. And our next event, next week, Michael Cochrane, who I think is in our audience somewhere here, is going to come and entertain us, I'm sure, with stories of his forebear. So thank you very much. And I'll just stop sharing my screen so we can see each other again. And oh, I haven't run over too much. But no, I don't think, no questions. But if you have any questions, by email, just send them. If you've got any ideas for things you want me to research for a future talk, send them over. And as I say, thank you very much for listening.